Meryl Streep stands in the first-class line dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around her. A man watches her with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. What happens next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. The Los Angeles International Airport buzzes with activity on this warm Tuesday afternoon. Travelers rush in all directions, dragging luggage while staring at departure boards. Announcements echo through the terminal, blending with hundreds of conversations into a symphony of human movement. In the middle of it all, a woman stands calmly, in the first-class line. That woman is Meryl Streep. She is dressed simply, a light blue button-up shirt, worn jeans that have clearly seen better days, and practical walking boots scuffed from actual walking. Her silver hair is pulled back into a casual ponytail, and she wears minimal makeup. She carries a weathered leather backpack that looks like it has traveled the world with her. There is nothing flashy about her, and perhaps because of that, she goes largely unnoticed. Yet anyone who takes a closer look might sense something different about her. It isn't just the way she dresses, but the calmness she exudes. She seems like someone who doesn't let the chaos around her affect her inner peace. While everyone else appears rushed and anxious, Meryl stands tranquil, observing everything around her as if soaking in the moment. She doesn't mind the occasional glances or the stark contrast between herself and the other first-class passengers in their designer clothes and expensive accessories. Behind her in line stands Bradley Morrison. Bradley is the complete opposite of Meryl. He wears a tailored charcoal suit that probably costs more than most people's monthly rent, Italian leather shoes polished to mirror-like perfection, and a gold watch that catches the light with every gesture. His dark hair is styled with precision, and his cologne announces his presence before he does. Bradley is the CEO of a rising tech company, and everything about him screams success, or at least his version of it. Every movement he makes seems rehearsed, as though he wants the world to know he is someone important. His eyes quickly scan the first-class line, mentally categorizing everyone based on their appearance. When his gaze lands on Meryl, his expression shifts subtly. The corner of his mouth twitches downward for a split second before he adjusts his posture, standing even taller. "First class today," Bradley says with an ironic smile, not directly addressing Meryl, but speaking just loudly enough for her to hear. "You never know who might end up here these days." Meryl turns her head slightly and looks at him, her expression remaining calm and unaffected. "Yes," she replies simply. "The world is full of surprises." Bradley frowns momentarily. He expected a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what he thought about the woman in front of him. But Meryl stays quiet, as if his comment doesn't matter in the slightest. Bradley shifts his weight, uncomfortable with being dismissed so easily. He clears his throat and decides to push further. "Look, nothing personal," he says, chuckling softly. "But you don't exactly seem like the type who flies first class. It's rare to see someone so casual in this line." A few people ahead turn slightly, their expressions showing discomfort at Bradley's rudeness. But Meryl doesn't seem bothered. She meets his gaze with steady eyes that hold something Bradley can't quite identify. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something that makes him feel suddenly self-conscious. "And what type would that be?" she asks, her voice gentle but firm. Before Bradley can respond, the line begins to move. The first-class passengers are now boarding, and the moment passes. Bradley straightens his tie unnecessarily and follows Meryl toward the gate, maintaining what he believes is a dignified silence. The boarding process is smooth and efficient. The flight attendants greet each passenger with practiced smiles. When Meryl approaches, one of them, Sarah according to her name tag, pauses almost imperceptibly. Her smile shifts from professional to genuine for just a moment before she regains her composure. "Welcome aboard," Sarah says, her eyes showing a flicker of recognition that she professionally conceals. "Have a pleasant flight." Meryl thanks her warmly and moves down the jet bridge. Bradley, following close behind, notices the interaction, but can't identify what made it different from his own greeting. As they enter the plane, Bradley checks his boarding pass and scans the cabin, mentally preparing for 5 hours of luxury. He makes his way to seat 3B, placing his briefcase in the overhead compartment. When he looks down at the window seat beside him, he freezes. Meryl is settling into seat 3A, placing her worn backpack under the seat in front of her. "You've got to be kidding me," Bradley mutters, shaking his head in disbelief. He sits down beside Meryl and lets out a low, incredulous chuckle. "Of all the seats on this plane," he says, not quite under his breath. Meryl looks at him with that same calm demeanor and gives a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then," she replies politely. Bradley crosses his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It isn't just sitting next to Meryl that bothers him, but the thought that this woman he had judged moments ago is now sharing the same exclusive space he believes himself entitled to. He can't quite explain why, but Meryl's presence unsettles him in a way he can't ignore. Perhaps it's her confidence without arrogance, or the way she seems completely comfortable in her own skin, without the trappings he relies on. Whatever it is, Bradley feels a strange need to reassert his perceived superiority. As other passengers continue boarding, moving past them toward the economy section, Bradley watches them with a sense of satisfaction. At least he isn't back there. He belongs here, in first class, though he's increasingly doubtful about his seatmate. Little does Bradley know that this chance encounter with Meryl Streep would become the most important moment of his adult life. The next few hours would challenge everything he believes about success, status, and the true measure of a person's worth. The flight attendants begin their final preparations as the last passengers find their seats. Bradley settles in, unaware that he is about to embark on a journey far more significant than the one marked on his boarding pass. The airplane cabin hums with activity as the last passengers find their seats. Bradley adjusts himself in seat 3B, subtly increasing the distance between himself and Meryl. He takes out his phone, making one final important-looking call before the flight attendants begin their pre-takeoff announcements. "Jeffrey, make sure the Hong Kong team understands we need those numbers by Thursday," Bradley says loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I don't care what time zone they're in. Tell them to make it happen." He ends the call with a dramatic sigh, as if carrying the weight of international business on his shoulders. Meryl doesn't react, simply gazing out the window at the ground crew finishing their preparations. The head flight attendant approaches their row. "Can I offer you a pre-departure beverage?" she asks with a professional smile. "Champagne," Bradley replies without looking up from his phone. "Preferably the Veuve Clicquot, not the house brand." The flight attendant nods and turns to Meryl. "And for you, ma'am?" "Just water would be lovely, thank you," Meryl responds with a warm smile that reaches her eyes. Bradley glances up, a smirk playing at his lips. "Water? In first class? That's like going to a 5-star restaurant and ordering toast." Meryl turns toward him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the simplest things are exactly what we need." Bradley shakes his head, unable to comprehend someone not taking full advantage of the first-class experience. "You're clearly not a frequent flyer up here. The whole point is indulgence." "Is it?" Meryl asks, genuinely curious. "I thought the point was comfort during travel." Bradley accepts his champagne from the returning flight attendant, taking a deliberate sip before responding. Comfort, luxury, status, they're all part of the package. That's why not everyone belongs here. A couple seated across the aisle exchange glances, clearly uncomfortable with Bradley's not-so-subtle implications. Meryl thanks the flight attendant for her water and takes a small sip, seemingly unbothered by Bradley's comments. "I find that belonging is more about how you behave than where you sit," she says quietly. Bradley narrows his eyes, studying Meryl more carefully. There's something about her composure that irritates him, a confidence that doesn't rely on external validation. It's foreign to his understanding of the world, and anything foreign must be challenged. "So what brings you to first class today?" he asks, his tone suggesting she must have a special reason to be there. "Special occasion?" "Work," Meryl replies, simply. "I'm heading to a film set." Bradley perks up, his interest piqued. "Oh, you work in film?" He glances at her simple clothes and worn backpack. "Costume department? Set design?" "Something like that," Meryl says with a slight smile, turning back to the window. Bradley isn't satisfied with the vague answer. He's used to people eagerly sharing their credentials with him, hoping to impress or form a connection. Meryl's reticence feels like a challenge. "I'm in tech myself," he volunteers, though she hasn't asked. "CEO of Morrison Innovations. Perhaps you've heard of us? We just closed a round of funding at $300 million. Congratulations," Meryl says sincerely. "That must be very rewarding." "It is," Bradley agrees, mistaking her comment as acknowledgement of his success. "It took years of strategic networking and aggressive business tactics to get where I am. Not everyone has what it takes." The plane begins to taxi, and the flight attendants perform their safety demonstration. Bradley continues scrolling through emails on his phone until the last possible moment, ignoring both the demonstration and the repeated requests to put devices in airplane mode. As the plane accelerates, down the runway, Meryl closes her eyes briefly, and Bradley notices a subtle change in her breathing, deeper, more intentional. She seems to be embracing the moment of takeoff rather than trying to distract herself from it. Once they reach cruising altitude, Bradley wastes no time reclining his seat and activating the screen in front of him to check the wine list. Meryl takes out a well-worn paperback, a collection of poetry by Mary Oliver. "Poetry?" Bradley asks with thinly veiled condescension. "I didn't think anyone read that anymore. Not exactly practical reading." Meryl looks at the book in her hands with genuine affection. "I find poetry helps me see the world differently. Sometimes we need to be reminded of the beauty in ordinary things," Bradley scoffs. "In my world, there's no time for that kind of luxury. Every minute needs to be productive or we fall behind." "Behind what?" Meryl asks with genuine curiosity. The question catches Bradley off guard. "Behind competitors, behind market trends, behind where we could be if we maximized every opportunity. And where is it all leading?" Meryl's question is gentle but pointed. Bradley blinks, momentarily at a loss. No one asks him these kinds of questions. "To success, obviously, to achievement, to winning." "I see," Meryl says, nodding thoughtfully. "And after you've won?" Bradley's expression hardens. This conversation isn't going the way conversations normally go for him. People usually defer to his opinions, not challenge the assumptions beneath them. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he says, though his tone suggests otherwise. "But not everyone understands the drive required to reach the top. Some people are content with mediocrity, and that's fine for them, but others of us push boundaries." Meryl doesn't appear offended. "I admire ambition," she says. "It's just interesting to consider what we're ambitious for." The flight attendant returns to take their lunch orders. Bradley selects the most expensive option without hesitation, the Ubo seared Wagyu beef, while Meryl chooses the simple grilled chicken salad. "Another missed opportunity," Bradley comments after the attendant leaves. "The Wagyu alone is worth the first-class ticket price." "I'm sure it's delicious," Meryl acknowledges, "but I prefer lighter meals when I'm traveling." Bradley shakes his head, increasingly frustrated by Meryl's apparent inability to appreciate the markers of status and luxury that he values so highly. There's a principle at stake now. He needs to make her understand. "You know," he says, leaning slightly closer, "I worked my way up from nothing. Nobody handed me anything. I earned my place here." Meryl meets his gaze, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. "That's admirable. Hard work should be respected." "Exactly," Bradley says, feeling vindicated. "That's why spaces like this exist, to reward those who've earned them." "And you believe that's determined by financial success?" Meryl asks Bradley. Feels the conversation shifting again. "Well, yes, that's how the world works. Success creates access." "I've found that true success is measured in impact, not access," Meryl says. "The lives we touch, not the spaces we occupy." Several nearby passengers have now begun listening to their conversation more attentively, some nodding subtly at Meryl's words. Bradley notices their reactions and feels a strange sense of being outnumbered, despite his certainty that he's right. The plane encounters a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to illuminate. As the aircraft shudders slightly, Bradley grips his armrests while Meryl remains perfectly calm, as if the physical disruption, like his verbal challenges, simply washes over her without effect. In this moment, though he would never admit it, Bradley feels the first hint of doubt about the encounter. He had expected to establish dominance easily, as he does in business meetings and social gatherings. Instead, he finds himself off balance, struggling to maintain his usual control of the conversation. The turbulence, it seems, isn't just outside the plane. The turbulence subsides and the cabin settles into a smooth flight. Bradley taps his fingers on the armrest, still unsettled by his inability to impress Meryl. He's not used to having his worldview challenged, especially by someone who seems so indifferent to the status symbols he values. The flight attendant arrives with their meals. Bradley's Wagyu steak is arranged artfully on fine china, accompanied by truffle mashed potatoes and seasonal vegetables. Meryl's chicken salad is simple but fresh, with a light vinaigrette on the side. Bradley cuts into his steak with exaggerated appreciation. "Now this," he announces, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "is what first class is about. You can't get this kind of quality back in economy." Meryl smiles politely. "It looks delicious." "You should have ordered it," Bradley says, chewing thoughtfully. "Your salad looks like something from a cafeteria." "I find it perfectly satisfying," Meryl replies, unconcerned. "Besides, I need to stay alert for work when we land." Bradley sees an opening. "Right, you mentioned film. So what exactly do you do? Assistant? Makeup?" A woman across the aisle glances over with a subtle smile, as if she knows something Bradley doesn't. "I contribute to storytelling," Meryl says simply. Bradley laughs. "That's vague. Come on, what's your actual job title? Does it matter?" Meryl asks, genuinely curious. "Of course it matters," Bradley replies, as if explaining something to a child. "Job titles define where you stand in the hierarchy. They tell people your worth." Meryl takes a moment before responding, carefully considering her words. "I found that titles often limit more than they define. People are so much more complex than the labels we give them." Bradley rolls his eyes. "That's the kind of philosophy people without impressive titles use." A few passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats, the conversation becoming increasingly awkward to overhear. "Perhaps," Meryl concedes with grace, "or perhaps it comes from seeing how easily we reduce each other to single dimensions." Bradley finishes his wine and signals the flight attendant for another. When she arrives, he orders with a flourish. "I'll have the 2015 Bordeaux this time." The flight attendant nods and turns to Meryl. "Would you like anything else, Ms. Streep?" "Just water is fine, thank you," Meryl interjects gently before the attendant can finish. Bradley notices the interaction, but misses its significance. Instead, he uses the moment to continue pressing his point. "Success leaves clues," he says, swirling his freshly poured wine. "The way you dress, what you order, how you carry yourself, it all signals your place in the world." "And what place would that be?" Meryl asks. "There's a natural order," Bradley explains confidently. "Some people are meant to lead, to innovate, to enjoy the finer things. Others are meant to support, to follow. It's not cruel, it's just reality." Meryl sets her fork down, giving Bradley her full attention. "And you believe you can determine someone's place in this order just by looking at them?" "First impressions matter," Bradley says firmly. "I built my career on being able to size people up quickly. It's rarely wrong. Rarely isn't never," Meryl points out. "What happens when you misjudge someone?" Bradley shrugs. "Risks of doing business. Better to occasionally underestimate someone than to waste time giving everyone the benefit of the doubt." An older gentleman seated nearby clears his throat disapprovingly. Bradley glances over with annoyance before continuing. "Look, I'm just being honest. The world rewards certain qualities, ambition, assertiveness, image. Playing by these rules got me where I am today." "And where is that exactly?" Meryl asks. The question catches Bradley off guard. No one asks him to justify his success anymore. "I'm at the top," he says defensively. "CEO of my own company, first-class traveler, respected in my industry." "That sounds impressive," Meryl acknowledges. "But I wonder, are you happy?" Bradley blinks. "Happy? What does that have to do with anything?" "I just wonder sometimes if we confuse achievement with fulfillment," Meryl says. "They can be very different things." Bradley laughs uncomfortably. "That's the kind of luxury philosophical Question that comes from not having real responsibilities. When you're leading a company with hundreds of employees, happiness takes a back seat to results. I see, Meryl says. So the trade-off is worth it? Absolutely, Bradley responds without hesitation, though something flickers in his eyes. Besides, success is happiness, getting what you want, being recognized for your achievements. That's what makes life worthwhile. Meryl considers this. I've met many successful people by that definition who were profoundly unhappy, and I've met people with very little who found tremendous joy in their lives. Bradley feels increasingly frustrated. This conversation is venturing into territory that makes him uneasy. That's a nice sentiment for a greeting card, but it's not how the real world operates. The real world is what we make it, Meryl suggests. We choose what to value, what to pursue, how to treat one another. A flight attendant approaches with Bradley's second glass of wine. As she places it on his tray, he barely acknowledges her, continuing his argument without pausing. Easy philosophical platitudes, he dismisses. Try building something substantial. In the real marketplace, dealing with real competition, real stakes, then we can talk about values. The flight attendant hesitates for a moment, looking at Meryl with a spark of recognition before moving on. I understand the pressures of performance, Meryl says, but I've found that how we treat people along the way matters just as much as what we achieve. That's where we disagree, Bradley says firmly. Results matter. Everything else is secondary. The people who can deliver get rewarded. Those who can't get left behind. Meryl looks at him with genuine curiosity. And what about those who can deliver but choose different priorities? Who measure success differently? Bradley shakes his head. Then they shouldn't be surprised when they don't end up in first class. Is first class the destination, or just a seat on the journey? Meryl asks. The question hangs in the air. Several passengers are now openly listening to their conversation, some nodding at Meryl's words. The woman across the aisle watches with particular interest, occasionally smiling at Meryl's responses. Bradley feels increasingly on the defensive, a position he rarely occupies in conversations. He's accustomed to others seeking his approval, not challenging his fundamental beliefs. You know, he says, leaning forward slightly, I think I've figured you out. You're someone who never quite made it to the top, so you've convinced yourself that the top doesn't matter. It's a common coping mechanism. A collective tension fills the cabin at this direct insult. The flight attendant passing by slows her pace, watching the interaction carefully. Meryl doesn't appear offended. Instead, she looks at Bradley with what almost seems like compassion. Perhaps, she says softly, or perhaps I've simply found that the view isn't always better from the top. The gentle wisdom in her voice resonates through the cabin. Two passengers exchange glances of approval. Bradley feels a strange sensation he's not accustomed to, like he's losing ground in a battle he didn't know he was fighting. He takes a large sip of his wine, needing a moment to regroup. This in-flight conversation has somehow turned into a referendum on his entire value system, and for the first time in years he feels genuinely challenged. The airplane engines hum steadily as they continue their journey, carrying not just passengers across physical distance, but Bradley toward a confrontation with himself that he never anticipated when he boarded. Bradley finishes his second glass of wine, feeling a growing need to reassert control over the conversation. Something about Meryl's calm confidence unnerves him. He's accustomed to people either being impressed by him or intimidated by him, never this peculiar mix of kindness and unshakable self-assurance. You know, Bradley says, adjusting his posture to appear more imposing, I'm curious what your family thinks about your philosophical approach to success. Do they appreciate the modest lifestyle it's provided? Meryl's expression remains unchanged, though something subtle shifts in her eyes. My family understands what matters to me. We value experiences over possessions, connections over status. How convenient, Bradley replies with a thin smile. And I'm sure that has nothing to do with limitations on what you could provide. A sharp intake of breath comes from the passenger behind them, clearly uncomfortable with Bradley's escalating rudeness. The cabin atmosphere grows tense as more passengers tune into their conversation. We all have limitations, Meryl acknowledges. The question is which ones we choose to accept and which ones we fight against. Bradley scoffs. That sounds like surrender disguised as wisdom. Or perhaps wisdom disguised as surrender, Meryl counters. Sometimes the strongest choice is knowing which battles aren't worth fighting. Bradley feels a flash of genuine anger. This woman, dressed simply, ordering the cheapest items, speaking in riddles, somehow makes him feel small despite his achievements. He needs to make her understand. "Let me tell you something about the real world," Bradley says, his voice harder. "Now, while some people sit around contemplating the meaning of success, others of us are creating it, building companies, creating jobs, driving innovation. The philosophers and poets get to judge from the sidelines because the doers make their comfortable lives possible." Meryl listens attentively, making Bradley even more frustrated. He wants her to react, to defend herself, to show some crack in her composure. "That's an interesting perspective," she says when he finishes, "though I wonder if the division between thinkers and doers is as clear as you suggest. Don't the best leaders also need to be philosophers of sorts, to question not just how to achieve goals, but whether they're the right goals to begin with?" A distinguished older gentleman across the aisle nods approvingly at Meryl's question. Bradley notices the reaction and feels increasingly isolated. "Philosophy doesn't meet payroll," Bradley says dismissively. "Results do. At the end of the day, your introspection doesn't build anything." "Doesn't it?" Meryl asks. "The stories we tell, the values we uphold, the way we treat each other. These build our culture, our communities, our very sense of what matters. That seems like building something essential." Bradley laughs, but it sounds hollow even to his own ears. "Next, you'll tell me your job in storytelling is changing the world." "Stories have always changed the world," Meryl replies simply. "They shape how we see ourselves and each other. They help us imagine what's possible." The flight attendant approaches with a fresh round of drinks, setting a water in front of Meryl and another wine before Bradley, without him having to ask. There's something in her manner, a certain deference toward Meryl that Bradley can't miss but also can't quite interpret. "You seem to have made quite an impression on the cabin crew," he observes after she leaves. Meryl smiles. "People respond. To kindness. It costs nothing but means everything." "Kindness doesn't build empires," Bradley retorts. "No," Meryl agrees, "but it might build better ones." Bradley feels his frustration growing. Every exchange leaves him feeling slightly more off balance, as if the ground beneath his certainty is slowly eroding. "You talk about kindness," he says, his tone sharpening, "but isn't there a certain cruelty in encouraging mediocrity? In telling people their modest achievements are enough when they could strive for more? I push people because I believe in their potential. There's a difference between encouraging growth and demanding conformity to a single definition of success," Meryl replies. "Real kindness isn't about lowering standards. It's about honoring the diverse ways people can contribute and find meaning." Bradley shakes his head. "That's a philosophy that leads to participation trophies and a workforce that can't compete globally." Several passengers exchange glances at Bradley's increasingly combative tone. The woman directly across the aisle watches with particular intensity, occasionally smiling at Meryl's responses. "I've found," Meryl says carefully, "that people perform at their best when they feel valued for their unique contributions, not when they're constantly measured against a single standard of success." "And where has this approach gotten you?" Bradley asks pointedly. "What have you built? What legacy will you leave?" For the first time, Meryl seems to consider whether to say more about herself. She studies Bradley for a moment before responding. "I've tried to tell stories that matter," she says simply. "Stories that help people feel less alone, that shine light on our shared humanity." "Stories," Bradley repeats dismissively. "While some of us create real value, others create entertainment." The woman across the aisle makes a small sound of disbelief. A flight attendant passing by slows, her expression concerned as she senses the mounting tension. Meryl remains unruffled. "Art is as essential to humanity as commerce, Mr. Morrison, perhaps more so. People lived fulfilling lives long before corporate structures, but they've never thrived without stories, without beauty, without meaning." "A convenient perspective for someone in your position," Bradley says. "And what position do you imagine that to be?" Meryl asks. genuine curiosity in her voice. Bradley gestures vaguely at her simple clothing, her worn backpack. Someone clearly on the fringes of the industry, probably freelance, occasional work, hanging on by your fingernails while pretending it's a choice. A collective tension descends over the nearby rows. The flight attendant hovers nearby, clearly considering whether to intervene. An older man across the aisle looks positively outraged. Meryl takes a slow, deep breath. When she speaks, her voice is quiet, but clear. "You seem very invested in seeing me as lesser than you, Mr. Morrison. I wonder what that's about." The simple question lands with unexpected force. Bradley feels exposed, as if Meryl has seen through his expensive suit and confident demeanor to something vulnerable beneath. That's not, he stammers, suddenly defensive. "I'm simply pointing out the realities of how the world works." "The world works in many ways," Meryl says. "Some measure success in dollars and titles. Others measure it in lives touched, moments of connection, art created, kindness shared. Neither approach is inherently superior. They're just different. Paths." Bradley feels a surprising sting behind his eyes. Something about her words touches a forgotten part of himself. A younger Bradley, who once had different dreams before ambition narrowed his vision to a single path. "Easy to say when you failed at the former," he replies, but his voice lacks its earlier conviction. Meryl looks at him with startling compassion. "Is it really failure if it wasn't what you were pursuing in the first place?" The question hangs in the air between them. Bradley feels strangely cornered, not by aggression but by a gentle wisdom that somehow sees through the armor he's spent years constructing. Around them, the cabin has grown uncommonly quiet. The tension is palpable as passengers watch the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Something is building toward a breaking point, though none can predict exactly what form it will take. What's clear to everyone, except perhaps Bradley himself, is that this isn't just an argument between strangers anymore. It's become a collision of worldviews, and possibly the beginning of a profound reckoning. The aircraft hits a patch of light turbulence, but the physical disturbance is nothing compared to the emotional turbulence Bradley now experiences. Meryl's last question, "Is it really failure if it wasn't what you were pursuing in the first place?" echoes in his mind, touching something he's kept buried for years. He reaches for his wine with a slightly trembling hand, taking a long sip to buy himself time. When he sets the glass down, his knuckles are white with tension. "You don't know anything about me," Bradley says, his voice lower but more intense. "You don't know what I've pursued or why." Meryl nods, acknowledging his point. "You're right. I don't know your story. Would you like to share it?" The simple invitation catches Bradley off guard. No one asks about his story anymore. Only his strategies, his success, his next moves. He finds himself responding before he can consider whether he wants to. "I grew up with nothing," he begins, his tone defensive. "Small town in Ohio. Father left when I was 8. Mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table." Bradley pauses, surprised by his own willingness to share this part of himself. Most of his current associates know nothing of his background. He's carefully curated a life story that begins with his first business success. "That sounds challenging," Meryl says, her attention genuine. "You must have worked very hard to get where you are now." "Harder than anyone knows," Bradley responds, a hint of his earlier bitterness returning. "I put myself through college washing. Dishes and stocking shelves overnight. No connections, no safety net, no privilege." The memory of those years, the exhaustion, the hunger, the constant fear of failure, tightens his chest. He'd promised himself he would never feel that vulnerable again. "So when people talk about values beyond success," Bradley continues, "it sounds like luxury to me. Philosophy is for people who've never worried about their next meal." Meryl listens, without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When Bradley falls silent, she speaks carefully. "Thank you for sharing that. It helps me understand your perspective better." She pauses before continuing, "Though I wonder if those experiences might lead to different conclusions. Couldn't they just as easily teach the value of community, of compassion, of measuring worth, beyond material success?" Something in her gentle questioning ignites a sudden fury in Bradley. She's dismantling his justifications, suggesting that the very hardships that formed his worldview could have shaped him differently. Don't you dare rewrite my life story to fit your narrative, he snaps, his voice rising. You have no idea what it's like to fight your way up from nothing, to have everyone expect you to fail, to prove them all wrong through sheer force of will. Heads turn throughout the cabin at his outburst. The flight attendant steps into the aisle, watching carefully. You're right, Meryl concedes. Everyone's path is unique. I'm not trying to rewrite yours. Aren't you? Bradley counters, his control slipping further. Sitting there in judgment, suggesting I've somehow taken a wrong turn because I value achievement and expect excellence? Some of us live in the real world where results matter and sentimentality is a luxury we can't afford. His voice has risen enough that passengers several rows away are now openly watching. The tension in the cabin is palpable. I don't see sentimentality and excellence as opposites, Meryl replies, her voice still measured. Some of the most excellent work I've witnessed came from people who brought their full humanity, including their compassion, to their craft. Right. Your storytelling, Bradley says dismissively. How convenient to work in a field where feelings matter more than metrics, where you can hide mediocrity behind artistic expression. A woman 2 rows ahead gasps audibly. The older gentleman across. The aisle shakes his head in disapproval. Meryl studies Bradley's face for a moment before responding. I sense there's something deeper here. This isn't just about different definitions of success, is it? The perceptiveness of her question strikes too close to home. Bradley feels a surge of panic, as if Meryl can somehow see past his carefully constructed facade to the frightened boy still hiding within. The child who learned early that vulnerability was weakness, and weakness meant you didn't survive. Don't try to psychoanalyze me, Bradley says, his voice now loud enough that everyone in first class can hear. That's what people like you do when you're losing an argument on facts. You make it personal. You appeal to emotion. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Morrison, Meryl says quietly. No, you're worse, Bradley retorts, standing up suddenly. You're a reminder of everything I rejected to get where I am. The comfortable mediocrity, the sentimental values, the acceptance of limits. The flight attendant steps forward. Sir, I need to ask you to lower your voice and take your seat. Bradley barely registers her presence. His focus remains fixed on Meryl, who sits calmly watching him with an expression that somehow combines compassion with unwavering strength. You think I don't see what you're doing, Bradley continues, ignoring the flight attendant. Playing the wise sage, acting like your choices are somehow more enlightened than mine. It's easy to preach contentment when you've never aimed higher. Sir, the flight attendant says more firmly, please sit down immediately. Bradley finally acknowledges her, his face flushed with emotion. Do you hear what this woman is saying? She's sitting there judging my entire life while he gestures dismissively at Meryl, probably hasn't accomplished anything worth mentioning. The flight attendant's expression changes from professional concern to barely concealed shock. Several passengers exchange meaningful glances. Mr. Morrison, Meryl says, her voice quiet but clear, why does my existence bother you so much? The simple question lands like a physical blow. Bradley sinks back into his seat, suddenly aware of the scene he's created. Every eye in the cabin is on him, expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disapproval. I don't, he begins, then stops. For perhaps the first time in years, Bradley Morrison finds himself completely without words. In the silence that follows, memories flood unbidden into his mind. His childhood dream of becoming an artist, abandoned when his father mocked his drawings. His college girlfriend who left because his ambition consumed everything, even their relationship. The look in his mother's eyes when he missed her 70th birthday for an acquisition meeting. Each memory carries the weight of a choice made, a value prioritized, a part of himself sacrificed on the altar of his narrowly defined success. Sometimes, Meryl says gently into the silence, what angers us most in others is what we've denied in ourselves. Bradley stares at his hands, now visibly trembling. The armor he's worn for decades, the certainty, the arrogance, the unquestioned assumptions about what matters, suddenly feels unbearably heavy. You don't know me, he whispers, but the words lack conviction. No, Meryl agrees, but I wonder if perhaps you've forgotten parts of yourself along the way. Around them, the cabin has grown unnaturally quiet. The flight attendant steps back, sensing that something important is unfolding. Even the usual sounds of an airplane in flight, the hum of engines, the occasional clink of glassware, seem muted, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Bradley Morrison, CEO, first-class passenger, self-made success, sits motionless, confronting questions he has spent a lifetime avoiding. And though he doesn't know it yet, this moment of breaking will ultimately become his salvation. The silence that follows Bradley's emotional outburst feels like it stretches for minutes, though in reality it lasts only seconds. He stares at his hands, avoiding the gaze of not just Meryl but everyone around him. For a man who has spent his adult life commanding attention, he now wishes desperately to be invisible. The flight attendant, Sarah, approaches their row again, this time carrying a tablet. She glances at Meryl with a subtle mix of respect and apology before addressing her. "Ms. Streep," she says in a professional tone that nevertheless carries throughout the quiet cabin, "the captain asked me to check if everything is all right. He also wanted me to let you know that we've adjusted our route slightly to avoid weather, but your connection in New York should still be on schedule for your flight to London." The name hangs in the air. Ms. Streep. Bradley's head snaps up, his eyes widening as they fix on Meryl's face, a face he's seen countless times before, on movie posters, at award ceremonies, in interviews, but somehow failed to recognize sitting right beside him. "Streep," he whispers, the color draining from his face. "Meryl Streep." Around them, the reaction from other passengers is varied, but unmistakable. Some exchange knowing glances. They had recognized her all along. Others look surprised, then embarrassed on Bradley's behalf. A few pull out phones, trying to discreetly take photos of the famous actress. Meryl thanks the flight attendant with genuine warmth. "Everything is fine, Sarah. Please tell Captain Reynolds I appreciate his consideration." As Sarah moves away, Bradley remains frozen, his mind struggling to process this new reality. He has spent the last 2 hours lecturing, dismissing, and ultimately shouting at one of the most acclaimed actresses in film history, a woman with more awards than he has business deals, whose cultural impact spans generations. Therefore, he finally manages to stammer, "You're Meryl Streep." Meryl meets his gaze calmly. "Yes," she says simply. Bradley's throat constricts. I never—" He gestures helplessly at her casual clothes, her lack of entourage, or special treatment. "Why didn't you say something?" "Would it have changed how you treated me?" Meryl asks. The question is gentle but pointed, and it pierces through Bradley's shock to something deeper. Of course it would have changed his behavior. He would have been deferential, even fawning. He would have name-dropped and networked, tried to impress her with his accomplishments. And that, Bradley realizes with a sickening clarity, is precisely her point. He begins, then stops, unsure what he can possibly say to make this right. "I had no idea who I was talking to." "That's the heart of it, isn't it?" Meryl responds. "We rarely do. Every stranger we meet carries stories we can't imagine, achievements we don't recognize, struggles we'll never fully understand." Bradley feels the eyes of the entire cabin on him. The woman across the aisle is openly smiling now, clearly enjoying his comeuppance. The older gentleman watches with undisguised disapproval. Even the flight attendants passing by seem to move with extra attentiveness around Meryl's seat. "I've made a complete fool of myself," Bradley says quietly. "Only if you miss the lesson," Meryl replies. Bradley stares at her, truly seeing her now, not just the famous actress whose films he's watched, but the human being whose wisdom he's dismissed, whose kindness he's mistaken for weakness, whose simplicity he's interpreted as lack. "I should apologize," he says, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Not for failing to recognize me," Meryl clarifies. "That's unimportant. But perhaps for assuming that my worth, or anyone's, could be measured by appearances, possessions, or titles." Bradley nods slowly, her words resonating with a truth he can no longer deny. "I've been incredibly arrogant, haven't I?" "We all have our moments," Meryl says with a slight smile. "The question is whether we learn from them." A young flight attendant approaches, looking nervous but determined. "Excuse me, Ms. Streep," she says. I hate to interrupt, but I just wanted to tell you that your performance in Sophie's Choice changed my life. I'm studying acting because of you. Meryl's expression brightens. That's very kind of you to say. What's your name? Jessica, the young woman replies, clearly thrilled to be acknowledged. Well, Jessica, keep following that passion. The world needs storytellers. The brief exchange is remarkable for its normalcy. Meryl treats this young, starstruck flight attendant with the same attentiveness and respect she's shown Bradley despite his rudeness. There's no hint of the superiority or dismissiveness that Bradley himself would likely have displayed to someone he perceived as beneath his station. As Jessica returns to her duties, visibly glowing from the interaction, Bradley finds himself confronting uncomfortable truths about the person he's become. So you're exactly the same with her as you were with me, he observes quietly. Of course, Meryl replies. Why would I be different? Most people change depending on who they're talking to, more impressed by those they think are important, less patient with those they don't. That sounds exhausting, Meryl says with gentle humor, and it misses so much. Some of the most extraordinary people I've met were those society might overlook. Bradley feels something shift inside him, a perspective tilting, assumptions crumbling. I've spent my entire adult life categorizing people by their utility to me, their status, their potential value to my business or my reputation. And has it made you happy? Meryl asks, echoing her earlier question that Bradley had dismissed. This time he doesn't deflect. No, he admits, the word barely audible. It's made me successful by certain metrics, but not happy. Not for a long time. Around them, passengers are still watching with undisguised interest, but Bradley no longer cares. Something more important than his public image is at stake now. I built my identity around proving my worth through achievement, he continues, speaking more to himself than to Meryl. Every promotion, every acquisition, every first-class seat was another piece of evidence that I'd escaped that poor kid from Ohio, that I mattered. You mattered before any of those accomplishments, Meryl says quietly. We all do. Bradley feels an unexpected sting of tears behind his eyes. When was the last time he cried? He can't remember. I think, he says with difficulty, I've been running so hard toward what I thought was success that I never stopped to question if it was the right destination. A murmur of conversation has resumed around them as passengers process the revelation of Meryl's identity. Several have angled their phones to capture discreet photos. 2 flight attendants confer in the galley, occasionally glancing toward their row. But Bradley notices none of this. For perhaps the first time in decades, he's engaged in a conversation without calculating its benefit to him, without performing for an audience, without maintaining his carefully constructed persona. It's never too late to change course, Meryl offers. Every day is a new opportunity to choose differently, even after a lifetime of wrong choices, Bradley asks. Especially then, Meryl responds with a warm smile. The awareness that something needs to change is the hardest step. Everything after that is just practice. Bradley looks at her, really, looks at her, and sees not the celebrity he failed to recognize, but the wise, gracious human being he failed to value. The revelation of her identity has shattered more than his composure. It has cracked open his entire worldview. And through that crack, something new begins to enter, a possibility he hasn't allowed himself to consider in years. That perhaps, just perhaps, he's been measuring success with the wrong metrics all along. The plane continues its journey eastward, the sky outside the windows gradually darkening as evening approaches. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere has shifted significantly. Passengers still steal glances toward Meryl, but their attention is now divided between the famous actress and the man beside her who just experienced such a public humbling. Bradley sits quietly, his mind replaying every interaction since boarding. Each dismissive comment, each arrogant assumption now echoes with painful clarity. He takes a deep breath and turns toward Meryl. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, he begins, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone, about measuring success differently. Meryl, who has been reading quietly, closes her book and gives him her full attention. What about it? I've never considered any other metric, Bradley admits. From my first job out of college, it was always about the next promotion. The bigger office, the more impressive title. Collecting status symbols became second nature. He gestures at his expensive watch, his designer suit. I thought these things would make me feel... He trails off, searching for the right word. Worthy, Meryl suggests gently. Bradley nods, surprised by her perceptiveness. Yes, worthy. Safe. Beyond judgment. And did they? For a while, maybe. Or maybe I just convinced myself they did. Bradley stares at his reflection in the darkened window. But it never lasts. There's always someone with more, always another level to reach. It's exhausting. Meryl considers this. I've known many people trapped in that cycle. The more they achieve, the emptier they feel. So they push for more achievement, hoping it will finally be enough. That's exactly it, Bradley says, a note of surprise in his voice. How did you avoid that trap? In your industry, there must be tremendous pressure to always be reaching for more. More roles, more awards, more acclaim. Meryl smiles slightly. I wasn't always immune. Early in my career, I tied too much of my worth to external validation. But over time, I realized that approach hollowed out the very thing that drew me to acting in the first place. The joy of inhabiting another person's reality, of telling stories that matter. Bradley listens intently, no longer performing the role of important businessman half listening while planning his next power move. For perhaps the first time in years, he's present, engaged in a conversation with no agenda beyond understanding. When, "Did it change for you?" he asks. It wasn't one moment, Meryl replies. More a series of realizations, often after disappointments or struggles. I began asking different questions. Not, will this make me more successful, but does this matter to me? Will it allow me to contribute something meaningful? A flight. Attendant approaches with dinner service, but Bradley hardly notices what's placed before him. He's too absorbed in their conversation, in the possibilities opening within him. I haven't asked those questions in decades, he admits after the attendant leaves. Maybe never. It's never too late to start, Meryl says. Bradley picks up his fork but doesn't eat. I keep thinking about my team at work. 23 people report directly to me, and I don't think I could tell you anything personal about most of them. Their children's names, their aspirations, what they care about outside work, nothing. Tomorrow could be different, Meryl suggests. They'd probably faint if I suddenly asked about their lives, Bradley says with a small, self-deprecating laugh. I've never been that kind of leader. What kind have you been? Bradley considers the question honestly. Demanding, results-oriented. I reward performance and punish failure. It's effective, but... But? Meryl prompts when he doesn't continue. But I wonder now if there's been a cost I never calculated. Bradley's voice grows quieter. No one stays long. We have high turnover. I've always blamed it on the industry, on weak character, on people who can't handle pressure. But maybe they needed something you weren't providing, Meryl finishes for him. Bradley nods slowly. Recognition as people, not just performers. Around them, the cabin has settled into the rhythm of the evening flight. The initial excitement over Meryl's identity has calmed, though occasional glances still come their way. Bradley, once hyper-aware of being observed, now finds he doesn't care. Something more important than his image occupies his thoughts. My last performance review with my assistant, he says suddenly, she tried to tell me she was struggling with her workload because her mother was ill. I cut her off, told her personal problems shouldn't affect professional output. He winces at the memory. I didn't even ask what was wrong with her mother. What would you do differently now? Meryl asks without judgment. Bradley thinks for a moment. Listen, offer support, maybe adjust her schedule temporarily. He shakes his head. Basic human decency. When did that become foreign to me? We become what we practice, Meryl says. If we practice seeing people as tools for our success, eventually that's all we see. And if we practice seeing them as people, Bradley asks, then we remember our shared humanity, our common struggles and hopes, Meryl smiles. It makes life richer, though admittedly more complicated. Bradley is quiet for a long moment. I think I've been afraid, he finally says, the admission clearly difficult for him. Of what? That if I let myself care too much about people, see them as more than assets or obstacles, I'd lose my edge. That compassion would make me weak. Meryl shakes her head. In my experience, the opposite is true. Understanding others, connecting with them authentically, it requires tremendous strength. Far more than keeping everyone at a safe distance. Bradley considers this perspective, so contrary to everything he's believed. I've fired people without a second thought, ended careers over single mistakes. I told myself it was just business. That sentiment had no place in tough decisions. And now? Now I wonder how many of those decisions I'd make differently if I'd considered the whole person, not just their last quarter's performance. The plane encounters mild turbulence, and Bradley instinctively grips the armrest. Meryl notices but doesn't comment. I've spent my life pursuing control, Bradley continues when the plane steadies, over my circumstances, my emotions, my relationships. I thought that's what strength meant. And now? Meryl asks again. Now I'm not sure what strength means anymore. Bradley's voice is quieter than it's been all flight. Everything I was certain about seems questionable. That uncertainty, Meryl says gently, might be the beginning of wisdom. Bradley looks at her with genuine curiosity. Does wisdom bring happiness? Because success, I've discovered, doesn't necessarily. Not happiness in the sense of constant pleasure, Meryl replies, but perhaps something deeper, fulfillment, purpose, connection, the sense that your life matters not just for what you've accumulated, but for how you've contributed. As the cabin lights dim for those passengers wishing to rest, Bradley finds himself contemplating questions he has avoided for decades. What does he want his life to mean? How does he want to be remembered? What if his definition of success has been fundamentally flawed? I've been running so hard, he says, almost to himself, that I never stopped to make sure I was running in the right direction. It takes courage to stop, Meryl observes, perhaps more than it takes to keep going. Bradley nods slowly. I think I've been afraid to stop, afraid of what I might find if I did. And now? Now I'm more afraid of continuing, as I have been. Bradley turns to face Meryl directly. Thank you, he says with uncharacteristic humility, for making me uncomfortable enough to question myself. Meryl smiles, her eyes reflecting genuine warmth. The best conversations often do make us uncomfortable. Growth rarely happens in comfortable places. As the night deepens outside the airplane windows, something new begins to take root in Bradley Morrison. Not a complete transformation yet, but the essential first step, the willingness to change. The captain's voice comes over the intercom, announcing their initial descent toward New York. Bradley glances at his watch, surprised to find they have less than an hour remaining in the flight. Time has passed differently during this conversation, more meaningfully somehow. Most passengers have drifted into sleep or private entertainment, the cabin dimly lit as the night deepens outside. Bradley sits quietly, wrestling with thoughts and emotions he's kept buried for years. Beside him, Meryl has returned to her book, giving him space for this internal reckoning. Bradley clears his throat softly. Miss Streep. She looks up from her reading. Meryl, please. Meryl, he repeats, the familiarity feeling unearned. I want to apologize. She closes her book, giving him her full attention. I'm sorry, Bradley begins, then immediately frowns. No, that's not right. I'm not just sorry, I'm ashamed of how I behaved. Meryl listens without interrupting, her expression open and attentive. When I first saw you in the airport, he continues, I made immediate judgments based on your appearance. I decided your worth, your story, your intelligence, all of it, based on superficial observations. I treated you with condescension because I assumed I was superior. He pauses, gathering his thoughts. I need to be clear, I'm not apologizing because you turned out to be famous. That would miss the entire point. I'm apologizing because no one deserves to be treated that way, regardless of who they are. A hint of approval crosses Meryl's face, as she recognizes the distinction. My behavior reflected something ugly in me, Bradley admits, his voice quieter now. Felt need to elevate myself by diminishing others, to validate my choices by invalidating different ones. He looks down at his hands, no longer the confident CEO, but a man confronting uncomfortable truths. The worst part is that I've been doing this for years, to colleagues, employees, service workers, strangers, without a second thought. It became so natural I didn't even notice anymore. Awareness is the first step toward change, Meryl offers gently. Bradley nods. This conversation has forced me to see myself from the outside, and I don't like what I see. The man I've become isn't who I intended to be. He falls silent for a moment, remembering. When I was younger, I had different dreams. I wanted to create something meaningful, to contribute something positive. Somewhere along the way, accumulation replaced contribution as my measure of success. It happens gradually, Meryl says, small compromises that eventually become a different path entirely. Yes, Bradley agrees, and with each step I convinced myself I was moving towards something important: status, security, respect. But sitting here now, I can see how hollow those pursuits have become. A flight attendant passes by, collecting empty cups and glasses in preparation for landing. Both Bradley and Meryl pause their conversation to thank her, Bradley making a point to make eye contact and offer genuine appreciation, a small but deliberate change from his earlier behavior. When they're alone again, Bradley continues. I've been thinking about what you said about stories, about their power to change how we see ourselves and others. Meryl nods encouragingly. I think I've been telling myself a very limited story, Bradley says. That worth comes from achievement, that vulnerability is weakness, that people are either assets or obstacles. He shakes his head slowly. It's not a story that's brought me much joy or connection. What story would you prefer to live? Meryl asks. The question catches Bradley off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead, focused as he's been on recognizing what's wrong, rather than envisioning an alternative. I'm not sure yet, he admits, but I think it would be one with more compassion, more curiosity about others, less judgment and more understanding. He gives a small, self-deprecating laugh. Basically the opposite of how I've been living. It's never too late to edit your story, Meryl says with a warm smile. That's the beauty of being human. We can always revise, reimagine, redirect. Bradley feels a surge of gratitude for this unexpected mentor who entered his life through a chance seating arrangement. Thank you for your patience with me. Most people would have shut down after my initial rudeness, but you stayed engaged. You saw something worth speaking to, even when I was at my worst. That's what good stories do, Meryl replies. They find the humanity beneath the facade. The plane begins its more pronounced descent, the change in altitude creating a subtle pressure in their ears. Bradley looks out the window at the distant lights of New York coming into view, a city where he's closed countless deals but formed few meaningful connections. I have another apology, he says, turning back to Meryl. To make. Oh? She asks. To myself, Bradley says quietly, for letting fear drive so many of my choices, for believing that success could only look one way, for missing countless opportunities to connect with others because I was too busy proving my worth. Meryl's expression softens. That might be the most important apology of all. Bradley nods, feeling a weight begin to lift. Not completely, but enough to notice the difference. I've been carrying this defensive arrogance for so long, I forgot what it feels like to simply be present with another person without calculating advantage or maintaining status. How does it feel now? Meryl asks. Bradley considers the question seriously. Terrifying, he admits with unexpected honesty. But also freeing. The captain announces their final approach to JFK International Airport. Flight attendants move through the cabin, checking that seats are upright and tray tables stowed. The normal end-of-flight routine continues around them, but Bradley feels anything but normal. I don't know exactly how to change decades of habits, he confesses, but I know I need to try. Start small, Meryl suggests, one interaction at a time. Ask questions and really listen to the answers. Look for the story behind the person. Practice seeing people in their fullness, not just their function in your life. Bradley takes a deep breath, committing her words to memory. I've spent my career focused on quarterly results. This feels like a much longer-term project. The most important ones usually are, Meryl says with a smile. As the landing gear descends with a mechanical whir, Bradley realizes something that sends a wave of emotion through him. In a few minutes, this transformative encounter will end. He'll walk off the plane a changed man, but without the guide who catalyzed that change. I wish we had more time, he says, surprising himself with the vulnerability of the admission. Sometimes the briefest encounters leave the deepest impressions, Meryl replies. What matters isn't how long we talk, but what you do with these realizations tomorrow and the day after, and the day after that. The plane descends through the clouds, the lights of New York growing clearer below. Bradley Morrison, who boarded this flight certain of his place in the world and contemptuous of those he deemed beneath him, prepares to land with humility, gratitude, and the first fragile seeds of a different way of being. As the wheels touch down on the runway, he makes a silent promise to himself and to the remarkable woman beside him. This landing will also be a beginning. The aircraft taxis to the gate, slowing to a halt amid the glittering lights of JFK International. As the seatbelt sign dims, passengers rise almost in unison, retrieving belongings from overhead compartments with practiced efficiency. Bradley remains seated, in no rush to end this unexpected journey of self-discovery. Your connection to London, he says to Meryl. Do you have enough time? She checks her watch and nods. Plenty. And you? I'm staying in New York for a few days. Meetings. He pauses, realizing how hollow that sounds now. Though I'm thinking differently about them already. Around them, passengers begin to file toward the exit, many stealing glances at Meryl as they pass. Some whisper to companions, others smile in recognition. But most respect her privacy, perhaps sensing the importance of the conversation still unfolding in row 3. When it's their turn to depart, Bradley retrieves Meryl's weathered backpack, along with his own sleek briefcase. The contrast between their luggage, like the contrast in their perspectives, strikes him as meaningful in a way it wouldn't have hours earlier. They walk together through the jet bridge, their pace unhurried despite the stream of hurried travelers around them. At the gate area, a small group of people wait with expectant expressions. Meryl's welcoming committee. My team, she explains, with a warm smile. They'll help me make my connection. Bradley nods, suddenly aware that their paths are about to diverge. I suppose this is goodbye. It is, Meryl confirms, though I hope the conversation continues in its own way. It will, Bradley promises. I have a lot to think about. They stand for a moment at this crossroads, the busy terminal flowing around them like a river around stones. Bradley extends his hand formally, then changes his mind and speaks from the heart. Thank you, he says simply, for seeing past my behavior to something better within me. Meryl shakes his hand with genuine warmth. We all contain multitudes, Mr. Morrison. The question is which parts we choose to nurture. With that, she joins her waiting team, exchanging warm greetings and immediately asking about their well-being with genuine interest. Bradley stands watching, as they make their way toward the international terminal, struck by how Meryl treats each person with the same attentiveness she showed him. No hierarchy, no performance. Just authentic, human connection. As Meryl disappears into the crowd, Bradley remains motionless, feeling oddly untethered. For the first time in years, he has no immediate impulse to check his phone, to assert his importance, to calculate his next strategic move. Instead, he simply observes the terminal around him with new eyes, the young mother struggling with luggage while soothing a crying child. The elderly couple moving slowly hand in hand, the harried businessman barking orders into his phone, oblivious to those around him. That last one hits uncomfortably close to home. Is that how he appeared to others? Impatient, entitled, disconnected from the shared human experience unfolding around him. Bradley approaches the mother, who's now dropped a stuffed bear while trying to manage her suitcase and toddler. May I help you with that? He asks, his voice gentle. She looks up, surprised by the offer from a man in an expensive suit. That would be amazing, thank you. He carries her larger bag, walking beside her toward ground transportation. Heading, Home or just beginning your journey? He asks. Home finally, she sighs. It's been a long trip. This little one doesn't enjoy flying much. In the past, Bradley would have found such conversation tedious, a distraction from more important matters. Now he finds himself genuinely interested in her story. By the time they reach the taxi stand, he's learned about her visit to her parents in Seattle, her husband waiting at home in Queens, and her daughter's favorite bedtime story. After helping her into a cab, Bradley declines her effusive thanks, with a simple, "It was my pleasure. Safe travels home." And the strange thing is, it was genuinely his pleasure. The brief connection leaves him feeling lighter somehow, more grounded in the moment. He makes his way to the luxury car service waiting area, where a driver stands holding a sign with Morrison printed in bold letters. The driver, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, begins his usual professional script. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison. I trust your flight was—" "Mohammed?" Bradley interrupts, reading the man's name badge. "That's your name, right?" The driver looks momentarily taken aback. "Yes, sir. Mohammed, how long have you been driving for Apex Car Service?" The question clearly surprises the driver, who has likely grown accustomed to clients who barely acknowledge his existence. 8 years next month, sir." 8 years, Bradley repeats thoughtfully. "You must have seen a lot of changes in the city during that time." As they walk toward the parking area, Bradley continues asking questions about Mohammed's family, 3 children, the oldest starting college next year, his journey to America from Pakistan 20 years ago, his favorite neighborhood restaurant, a small Pakistani place in Jackson Heights that makes biryani like my mother's. By the time they reach the car, Mohammed's professional reserve has given way to genuine conversation. As he puts Bradley's briefcase in the trunk, he seems more relaxed, more present. "Where to, Mr. Morrison?" Mohammed asks as they settle into the car. Bradley gives the address of his usual luxury hotel, then hesitates. "Actually, no. Could you recommend somewhere good for dinner? Somewhere real, not a tourist place. Maybe that biryani restaurant you mentioned." Mohammed's surprise shows in the rearview mirror. "Seriously? It's not fancy at all." "That sounds perfect," Bradley replies. "I'm trying something new tonight." As they drive through Queens, Bradley gazes out the window at neighborhoods he's passed countless times without truly seeing. Streets alive with cultures, histories, and stories he's never bothered to notice. Tonight, each lit window represents lives unfolding, complex, valuable, worthy of respect regardless of title or status. The restaurant is indeed modest, a small family operation with simple furniture and walls adorned with photographs of Pakistan's mountain landscapes. The aromas of cardamom, cumin, and ginger fill the air. Bradley thanks Mohammed, who introduces him to the owner with evident pride. Later, over a plate of the most flavorful biryani he's ever tasted, Bradley checks his phone. For the first time since landing, 27 emails, 14 text messages, 3 missed calls, all marked urgent, all demanding immediate attention. Yesterday, these notifications would have triggered an immediate response, a surge of self-importance. Today, they seem strangely hollow. He puts the phone aside and instead asks the owner about the photograph of mountains on the wall. The man's face lights up as he describes his hometown in northern Pakistan, his hands painting pictures in the air as he speaks of valleys and rivers and traditions spanning generations. Bradley listens, truly listens, with no agenda, no calculation of benefit, no impatience for the conversation to serve his purposes. He simply bears witness to another human being's story, and in doing so, feels more connected to the world than he has in years. Walking back to his hotel later that evening, Bradley Morrison moves through a city transformed, not because New York has changed, but because he is beginning to see with new eyes. Each passing face contains a universe of experiences, hopes, struggles, and dreams, just as valid and complex as his own. In his hotel room, he sits at the desk and opens his laptop. Instead of diving into work emails, he begins typing a different kind of message, one that has been forming in his mind since the plane touched down. "Dear team, tomorrow morning's meeting will be different. I want to hear from each of you, not just about the quarterly numbers, but about your ideas, your challenges, and what you need from me to do your best work. The transformation that began at 36,000 feet continues. One word, one interaction, one moment of presence at a time. 6 months later, Bradley Morrison stands in the familiar bustle of LAX, the same airport where his journey began. He wears dark jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and comfortable shoes. His expensive watch has been replaced by a more modest timepiece, his designer briefcase by a practical leather messenger bag. But the most noticeable change isn't in his appearance, it's in his demeanor. He moves through the terminal with unhurried steps, present in a way he never was before. His gaze is attentive, his expression open. When the barista at the coffee counter thanks him, he responds with genuine warmth, calling her by the name on her tag. When an elderly man struggles with the digital check-in kiosk, Bradley pauses to offer assistance. These small acts of connection have become second nature over the past 6 months, a daily practice that has gradually reshaped his understanding of success. At the gate, Bradley notices a young man in his 20s wearing a worn suit that doesn't quite fit, nervously reviewing notes before a business trip. Something about his determined expression reminds Bradley of himself 20 years ago, hungry for success but unsure of his place in the world. "First business trip?" Bradley asks, sitting down beside him. The young man looks up, surprised. Is that obvious?" Bradley smiles. "I've been there. Mind if I offer some advice?" "Please," the young man says, clearly relieved to talk with someone who seems so at ease in this environment. "The people you're meeting, they're just people," Bradley says. "Not gods, not gatekeepers, just humans doing their best, like you." He pauses. "And their opinion of you matters far less than your opinion of yourself." "That's not what I expected," the young man admits. "I thought you'd give me tips on asserting dominance in the room or something." Bradley laughs. "I would have 6 months ago. I've learned a few things since then." As boarding begins, Bradley wishes the young man well and makes his way to his seat. Economy plus, this time, a deliberate choice. First class is still within his means, but the symbolism of sitting among a more diverse cross-section of humanity matters to him now. Once settled, Bradley takes out his phone and looks at a photo taken yesterday. His executive team gathered around a table, faces animated in discussion. The quarterly meeting that once would have been a series of formal presentations has transformed into a collaborative workshop where every voice contributes. He scrolls to another photo, a community center being constructed in Ohio, not far from where he grew up. The Bradley Morrison Youth Arts program will open next month, offering free classes in everything from painting to digital design for children who, like him, come from families without the means for private lessons. A text message arrives from his assistant. "Mrs. Chen says thank you for the time off to attend her daughter's graduation. She'll have those figures ready when she returns Monday." Bradley smiles, remembering how dismissive he once was of personal problems affecting work schedules. Now he understands that honoring the whole person, their commitments, their challenges, their celebrations, creates not just a more humane workplace but a more effective one. His company's retention rate has improved dramatically, along with morale and, surprisingly, productivity. The middle seat beside him is taken by a woman with a small child. Bradley helps her stow her bag and entertains the toddler with silly faces while she gets settled. 6 months ago, he would have been annoyed by the prospect of sitting next to a child. Today he sees it as an opportunity for connection, for joy. As the plane taxis for takeoff, Bradley thinks about the speech he'll deliver tomorrow at the business leadership conference, not the one he originally submitted about maximizing shareholder value, but the revised version about redefining success to include impact, connection, and purpose. He wonders briefly if Meryl will see it. Her words have stayed with him these past months, guiding his choices, challenging his assumptions. He never reached out to her directly. That felt somehow inappropriate. But he hopes that somewhere she might recognize the ripples of their encounter continuing to spread. The flight attendant begins the safety demonstration, and Bradley gives her his full attention, a small act of respect that once would have seemed beneath him. When she catches his eye, he smiles, and she returns the gesture, perhaps noting the rare passenger who actually watches the demonstration. Midway through the flight, a minor disruption occurs several rows ahead, a passenger becoming agitated about the meal options. The flight attendant tries to defuse the situation, but the man's voice grows louder, his tone more demanding. Bradley recognizes himself in that passenger, the entitlement, the public display of displeasure, the need to assert status through conflict. Without hesitation, he rises from his seat and approaches. "Excuse me," he says quietly to the flight attendant. "I'd be happy to trade my meal with this gentleman if that would help." The simple offer shifts the dynamic. The agitated passenger looks momentarily confused, then slightly embarrassed. "That's not necessary. I'm fine with what's available." Bradley returns to his seat, exchanging a knowing glance with the flight attendant, who mouths a silent, "Thank you." It's a small moment, quickly over, but representative of the hundreds of choices he now makes differently each day. As the plane begins its descent into New York, Bradley recalls that turbulent descent 6 months ago, not just the physical descent of the aircraft, but his own emotional turbulence as his worldview was challenged. How fitting that this return flight has been smooth, steady, controlled, much like the man he is becoming. The passenger beside him notices his contemplative expression. "Afraid of landing?" she asks kindly. Bradley smiles. "Actually, I was just thinking about how sometimes the most important journeys happen while we're traveling somewhere else." After landing, Bradley makes his way through the terminal, nodding to familiar faces among the airport staff. Mohammed from car services, Sonia at the coffee shop, Raj at the newsstand. He knows them now, greets them by name, asks about their families. These small connections have become the fabric of a life more richly lived. Outside, rather than heading to his usual luxury hotel, Bradley takes the subway downtown to a modest neighborhood restaurant, where he's meeting a group of young entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds, part of a mentoring program he started that pairs established business leaders with promising talent from underserved communities. As he waits for them to arrive, Bradley takes out a small notebook, not the leather-bound planner of his previous life, but a simple composition book. On its pages are not only business ideas and meeting notes, but also observations, questions, moments of gratitude, and reminders of the person he is trying to become. He turns to a blank page and writes a single sentence. "6 months ago today, Meryl Streep changed my life." Then he adds, "But only because I finally listened." The door opens and 5 young people enter, their faces lighting up when they see him. Bradley rises to greet them, learning long ago that the most powerful position in any room is not above others but alongside them. In the end, what matters isn't the seats we occupy on our journey through life, but how we treat our fellow travelers along the way. Meryl Streep's quiet wisdom continues to echo, not just in Bradley's transformed life, but in the lives of everyone he now touches with newfound compassion, humility, and purpose. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience, reminders that even in our most difficult moments, the possibility for meaningful change is always within reach.